All right. So if you're ready, Dr. Henriksen, I'll go ahead and introduce us, or you. um, Today we'll be hearing from Dr. Jennifer Henriksen about issues related to the intersection of cybersecurity and journalism. Dr. Henriksen is an assistant professor here at WSU in the College of Communication. She has fellowships at, among other places, Yale, Columbia, and the University of Fribourg, which I had to look up is in Switzerland. She earned her PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. And with that very brief introduction, I will hand things over to her to talk more about her work. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you for being here. So I want to start my talk today with a quote that helps us think about why journalism is important for democracy. And the quote reads, "Democracies die in darkness. History proves that. And we think we're resilient. I think we are. We think we're strong. We think that we have a process that will protect us from that. But if we are infected with hate and infected with a lack of knowledge, we could partake of losing our wonderful democracy." American journalist Bob Woodward of Watergate fame said this back in 2017 about the Trump administration. And he was actually paraphrasing Damon J. Keith, a former judge of the US Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, who in a 2002 case wrote, "Democracies die behind closed doors." So although these words have been around for 2 decades, they resonate today when we consider the relationship between journalism and democracy and the various challenges both face. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to be here and speaking with you. As James mentioned, I'm Dr. Jennifer Henriksen, and I study journalism and digital technologies within the field of communication. And my research broadly examines how actors exploit weaknesses in the spread of information across institutions to contaminate the information ecosystem and to erode trust in knowledge systems. Specifically, I assess how these and other challenges, from state and corporate surveillance to physical and digital attacks against the media, are creating an epistemic crisis for journalism. And this crisis throws into jeopardy the possibility of imagining a future that connects journalism and democracy in efficacious ways. Personal and professional information is being violated in countries around the world. It's being collected in targeted and aggregate ways as we go about our daily lives. One profession in particular, journalism, is tasked with keeping information in a sanctified space. Yet, myriad factors prevent journalists from taking available steps to better protect themselves, their communications, and their sources, despite increasing levels of surveillance, digital attacks, and political enmity. So I investigate why journalists and newsrooms are resistant to these new technologies that enhance their abilities to carry out their watchdog role in a democratic society. And in doing so, I articulate how such adherence to the status quo parallels an intransigence and subsequent fragility facing democratic institutions more broadly and poses a threat to the modern political project of liberal democracy. So today I'll be sharing one piece of a larger research project which examines how individuals, organizations, and institutions engage with key questions related to digital technologies and journalism. And this research is situated within a frame of new institutionalism from a journalism studies perspective. So my talk today centers on the reasons behind why journalists and newsrooms are reluctant to adopt protective new technologies. In my analysis of how digital technologies implicate the practice of journalism, I explore the following questions. In what ways do journalists think about information security? How do news organizations resist or develop information security cultures? What are the characteristics of information security cultures in newsrooms? And I find competing institutional logics that reward maintaining the status quo while simultaneously signaling security to enhance external legitimacy to various audiences. So this paradox of stasis and change has important repercussions for journalism and also implicates governance, democratic governance, since journalism has long held a normative role in providing information to publics and holding power to account. So how did we get here? And why is security important for journalism? At the most basic level, security is important for journalism because journalists are harmed for their work. Violence toward journalists, including assault and murder, has been an ongoing threat for decades, with more than 1,400 journalists killed in response to their work since 1992. And this is globally, and this information, these data points come from the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a nonprofit organization, has headquarters in New York, and it's between 1992 and 2023 with motive confirmed. Security is not only associated with physical harm, but it's often linked to digital harassment and abuse. For example, journalists are known to have experienced online monitoring or online harassment before experiencing physical safety challenges. Online harassment of journalists is also on the rise. In a 2019 survey, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the same organization I just referenced, found that online harassment was the biggest threat among 90% of the journalists surveyed. Female journalists are reported to more likely experience digital harassment than their male peers, while journalists of color and those who cover hot button issues like white nationalism, politics, or race are increasingly targeted. Alongside harassment is political rhetoric, which slanders media organizations, especially those who have been critical of power. And such rhetoric can result in public confusion of what is true and what is false and can increase trust in the media. Journalists and news organizations are also hacked by state and non-state actors. Such digital harm can occur through phishing attacks, such as when the Syrian Electronic Army successfully gained access to the AP's Twitter account by sending malware through a phishing email. The hackers were then able to access the AP Twitter account and sent out erroneous tweet, which you see here, which resulted in the brief erasure of $136 billion in equity market value. Digital harm can also occur through software and hardware exploits of a user's devices or networks, such as when the New York Times Moscow Bureau was targeted by hackers, or when the Washington Post, the New York Times, Bloomberg News, and the Wall Street Journal were all targeted by Chinese cyber attacks. More recently, the use of commercial spyware products like NSO Group's spyware known as Pegasus have come into public view. Pegasus spyware can bypass the phone security and gain complete access to the device, including messages, GPS, photos, video, emails, and the phone's microphone. And it's sold to governments by NSO Group, ostensibly for law enforcement purposes, but recent revelations have shown how the technology has also been used by different authoritarian governments to target journalists and others in order to surveil and censor them. So this increasing ubiquity and interconnection of our digital technologies generate data and metadata about ourselves, our networks, our locations, and our habits, which in turn implicates key tenets of journalistic practice, such as communicating with sources to obtain information to help hold powerful actors and interests to account. And we know that journalists, as collectors, curators, and disseminators of information, are at heightened risk for potential observation and investigation by powerful entities. The 2013 Snowden revelations clarified our understanding of the nature of some of these types of surveillance programs that collect communications and in turn can implicate journalists and journalism. While we only need to look to the news to see other examples of journalists being surveilled, their communications accessed, or their sources investigated. And yet, protective strategies remain nascent or non-existent. In a poll with Pew Research Center, we found that 80% of investigative journalists in the United States who were surveyed believe that merely being a journalist may increase the likelihood that the government will collect their data. Yet 50% of journalists indicated they do not use any digital security tools to protect their information. In addition, the majority of journalists have not received formal training or instruction about digital security, and only 27% of journalists surveyed had spent some time in the past 12 months researching how to improve it. Therefore, although US investigative journalists may feel that being a journalist may make them more vulnerable to information security concerns, this belief hasn't inspired significant behavior changes around protective digital technologies. So I wanted to understand this paradox, which led me to the following questions. In what ways do journalists think about information security? How do news organizations resist or develop information security cultures? What are some of the characteristics of information security cultures in newsrooms? So let's take the first question. In what ways do journalists think about information security? And by information security, I mean the protection of information and information systems from unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction in order to provide confidentiality, integrity, and availability. How do news organizations resist or develop information security cultures? Well, we got to understand what we mean by information security cultures. So by this, I mean the shared patterns of values, mental models, and activities that are traded among an organization's employees over time, affecting information security. And finally, that third question, what are the characteristics of information security cultures in newsrooms? So to answer these questions, I use the theoretical frame of new institutionalism, which originally derives from sociology, but has since been applied to a number of fields, including journalism studies. And I chose new institutionalism to understand this paradox of stasis and change within journalism because its sociological view of institutions illuminates how they interact, how they can influence human behavior, and how they aim to gain legitimacy and survive within a world of other institutions. Within new institutionalism, there is the concept known as the institutional entrepreneur. And the institutional entrepreneur is an individual capable of sparking institutional change because they are creative individuals whose social positions and skills allow them to recognize problems or opportunities and take advantage of enabling conditions to alter the social order. Another crucial concept within new institutionalism is isomorphism. And by isomorphism, I mean when institutional fields mirror dominant practices and forms to avoid claims of negligence and to gain public legitimacy. Finally, decoupling is also an important concept within new institutionalism. And by this, I mean when organizations seek to achieve institutional legitimacy by engaging in superficial change or action while still continuing core activities. Interestingly, little academic attention has actually focused on the interplay between new institutionalism concepts of isomorphism and decoupling. So this project that I'm talking about today addresses this gap by examining how the two forces intersect to reveal the dueling environments within news organizations. So to investigate the research questions that I mentioned, I conducted 30 semi-structured interviews with journalists, technologists, and media lawyers from national and local news organizations in the United States, as well as individuals from nonprofit organizations and academic institutions. And my interviewees came from a wide variety of organizations. They ranged from small to large organizations. Some were mainstream legacy newspapers, while others were local, digital first, or investigative outlets. I interviewed 18 men and 12 women. They identified as white, Black, Latinx, or Indian. Each interview lasted an average of 46 minutes, was recorded and transcribed in full. And I selected the subjects in a snowball sample because of the sensitivity of the topic and the need for trust. Finally, I used Sharmaz's constructivist grounded theory approach and used open, focused, and theoretical coding techniques on my collected data. So to my first research question, in what ways do journalists think about information security? I found that security is perceived as an individual responsibility and not a collective one. One information security trainer said that people are not necessarily always plugged into this idea of security being everybody's job, nor have they internalized the notion that everyone with access to digital and physical assets has a shared responsibility. A media lawyer agreed, observing that people who don't think security applies to them and thus don't take it seriously can actually undermine and compromise information security for everyone else because they're careless. Those are the people that were victims of phishing attacks. Journalists may also assume that they don't need to think about security, even though they share a collective space with reporters who might do work on more sensitive issues. One journalist who has worked as an ad hoc security trainer in the newsroom recounted misconceptions of security. Her colleagues would say, "Oh, that's not me, that's somebody else." But no, are you in charge of your passwords? Yes, you are. So this privileging of the individual over the collective can be problematic for information security cultures because reporters are reliant on a networked infrastructure. If a journalist clicks on a phishing email by accident, it could have repercussions for the larger newsroom. Second, journalists tend to hold a perception that they do not need to be concerned about information security unless they were reporting on something obviously sensitive that could result in intrusion from the government. One media lawyer said that the vast majority feels like nobody's out to get them. They're not doing anything that's important. Nobody's going to try to steal their stuff. Even the ones that are doing sensitive stuff feel like they're generally protected. So this belief relates to what McGregor and Watkins have called a security by obscurity mental model, in which journalists feel like they have nothing to worry about as long as they don't report on topics that might concern the government and its ability to surveil. Alongside the security by obscurity mental model is a model I'm calling the security by insularity model, in which journalists believe that they are insulated from risk, in part because they are journalists working in a democracy with certain normative expectations and because they have yet to experience a known digital attack and thus maintain a reactive security posture. One journalist said, "Security is a really easy thing to overlook, especially if you haven't had a breach. If you haven't been intimately involved in wide-scale harassment or doxing or swatting or being hacked, people just think the stakes are really low and they're just wrong." So this security by insularity mental model is briefly shaken when a high-profile example hits closer to home, such as if a colleague has experienced a digital attack, for example. But then it evaporates. A media lawyer acknowledged this evaporation of concern by stating, "Every time there's a high-profile example, people start to care, but it fades pretty quickly. I think it has to be real for them in order to feel like it's worth going through the hustle of using some of these technologies." Third, and relatedly, journalists and management have a reactive orientation to security concerns. A security trainer talked about how it's a recurring pattern in newsrooms where something bad happens and then management gets together to address how to prevent it from happening again, but it's already happened. He said, "People don't really think that they're going to be the target of online harassment until it happens, or they don't care about security until they're hacked." Another trainer said, "Usually it's very reactive. Something bad happened and they need help." And this is in part because, as one director of information security said, being proactive requires a whole lot of work and a whole lot of being on top of everything. I think that unless you are specifically into digital security, then you're just probably not going to do it. But as we know, such a reactive posture has implications for journalists who are trying to carry out their jobs. One journalist who has been harassed for more than a year following the publication of an investigative database said she did not know at what point to be really scared. She expected management to come up with a plan and have that in place if the harassment crossed a threshold of some sort, but there was never a plan of action. She said, "Something bad, really bad needs to happen for people to take it seriously. It's just incompetent management, really. I feel like my direct supervisor will take me seriously, but for these things to happen, there's money involved." So this reactive orientation among journalists and management points to an ongoing tension between journalistic craft and security implementation, where security knowledge is still viewed as outside the domain of journalism and thus is not prioritized until after an incident has occurred. Reactive approaches to security by journalists and editors can result in a too little, too late response, which in turn can undermine the security of the journalist as well as the larger newsroom. So in sum, security tends to be viewed as something that is individually important rather than a collective responsibility. Journalists adopt a security by obscurity or a security by insularity mental model. And journalists and management have a reactive orientation to security, which can put reporters and newsrooms at risk. So let's move to the second question. How do news organizations resist or develop information security cultures? First, security tools and practices are perceived frequently as at odds with journalistic form and craft. One media lawyer said, "You want ease of use, but you also want security, and those things can work against each other. Sometimes you're just going to have to compromise on one or the other." And as we know, journalists are often focused on the here and now and getting a story out immediately. But as one information security trainer put it, security requires developing a digital security sensibility and an operational security mindset. It takes a lot of proactive learning and normalizing certain tools in a journalist's day-to-day functioning. Journalists also need to balance using security tools with not scaring their sources away. One information security technologist and former journalist said, "You have to walk this line between having them use," I think I'm echoing. There we go. Walk this line between having them use something that's maybe digitally safe or encrypted or whatever without scaring them off, freaking them out. Another journalist indicated that there is a misconception among reporters that sources know what's safe to use. It's really naive and a little honestly self-serving that reporters say, "Oh, the source wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't safe." He recounted how it's a frail concept of informed consent. Very often the sources don't really know what kinds of risks they're putting themselves in. Second, conflicts between IT and journalism are at play. So sometimes IT teams may block virtual private networks or Tor within a newsroom, even though the reporters there are being advised by outside security experts to use those technologies. And this can lead to a situation where, despite official applications and tools that journalists are allowed to use, journalists, quote, go rogue when implementing security tools for their work. And such an environment leads to what security experts have called a shadow IT culture, where reporters create their own tech setups and their own lines of communication that are outside of the domain of their IT department. Yet, as we know, the IT department can contribute to a more robust security culture by keeping technologies maybe in-house or relying less on third-party platforms. A media lawyer remarked that her organization does not use a lot of third-party servers because they have an internal proprietary system, which is needed because of the way that their distribution network is set up. In turn, she says, there's a certain amount of security that's built into that. And I think there's a perception that it's adequate. I don't think the journalists feel like, for the most part, that they need to do more than that. So security is thus outsourced within the organization because it does not fit with the normal routines and tasks of journalism. Such outsourcing suggests that security is secondary to the normal undertakings of news gathering, as indicated by the more traditional components of researching and writing a story. And this implication aligns with how innovations in journalism have historically occurred, with new technologies related to journalism or to types of journalists like photojournalists or data journalists viewed, at least initially, as outside the central conception of who a journalist is or what a journalist does. Yet, if security is perceived as external to journalism, it will not be fully or robustly integrated in a way that's holistic and effective. So in sum, the implementation and relevance of information security remains at odds with various aspects of news work. Journalists have to balance competing temporality considerations in their work and sources' comfort with technologies. The now, as we know, is often prioritized in journalism, as is rapid access to a source and the source's information. And ongoing tensions and competing institutional logics can cause frictions between different departments. And these can limit successful integration of security tools and practices. So this takes me to my third question. What are the characteristics of information security cultures in newsrooms? To answer this question, I looked at the adoption of the anonymous whistleblowing submission platform known as SecureDrop. Initial adoption of this platform was slow following its introduction around 2013, but the adoption of this platform increased significantly following the election of Donald Trump. As of right now, around 70 major news organizations globally have it installed. So I wanted to understand what we could learn from the successful adoption of this security tool, which can help keep sources safe. First, it leaves many aspects of the traditional reporting process the same because it accommodates a news organization's ongoing goal of providing ways for sources to communicate and to share information. Second, SecureDrop is typically a one-time investment with a news organization installing it and training a few individuals in its use. One journalist likened it to installing a ramp at the entrance of your newsroom. Once it's there, and you don't have to spend too much money on it. Though SecureDrop does require some maintenance, it's not considered an information security tool with high overhead or ongoing costs. Implementing SecureDrop serves as a signal to audiences and potential sources that the news organization takes the protection of sources seriously. But this adoption of SecureDrop without other institutionalized security practices also reveals a legitimacy gap. One new social actor inadvertently trying to fill that gap is an institutional entrepreneur that I call the security champion. So these security champions are individuals who care about information security and who try to get their colleagues and bosses on board with improving information security within the newsroom. And they live across the newsroom. Originally, there was some thought that maybe they only stayed in investigative or on investigative desks or national security, but they're really cross-cutting in the newsroom, which is kind of interesting. One media lawyer said, interestingly, they're not all necessarily national security reporters. They know a lot about the subject matter and they know a lot about technology, and they just happen to be really into it. And they encourage people to use it in a certain way. They are, in a way, some of the best ambassadors. They get it, they know how to do it, and they can explain it to their peers. So security champions share expertise across the newsroom and proactively teach their peers. One data journalist turned security champion said, anything that I've done, I've just gone ahead and done it, and then asked for sign-off, asked for forgiveness, not permission, kind of a thing. And generally, my managers have been very welcoming to any ideas I've had. It's not that they didn't think it was important, it's just that they didn't think of it or they didn't have time to think of it. Information security trainers who might be external or in some cases internal to a news organization, although that's pretty rare, rely on these security champions to spread information security knowledge. One information security trainer said, "We need to find a couple people to buy into what we're doing on that specific desk," so maybe investigative desk or politics or whatnot, "before we can make real progress with that team when they don't already have that culture of security mindedness on their team." Yet, the reliance on fellow journalists and IT as information security experts can be problematic, according to a security technologist, because, as he said, IT and data journalists are not information security experts. But in your average news organization, they're the closest thing. That's what people believe. But it's not the right shape to go through that hole. It's not the correct mapping at all. But, it's like the best they have right now. So in sum, we've learned that security needs to work for journalism in ways that leave traditional reporting processes intact, such as through the adoption of a tool like SecureDrop. We've also learned that the lack of institutionalized security practices within news organizations has led to a popping up of security champions who care about security and want their peers to practice more secure behaviors, but their lack of specific technical expertise can also complicate holistic security in the newsroom. So these characteristics reveal that journalists gravitate towards change in subtle but patterned ways, which in turn has implications for journalism's role in a democratic society. First, journalists' adherence to mental models of security by obscurity and security by insularity reflect a resistance to changing behaviors related to information security practices, thereby implicating newsroom security more generally. In addition, a reactive orientation to security concerns can result in journalists' withdrawal from social media platforms, despite relying on these platforms to publicize their work, cultivate sources, and engage audiences. Second, competing institutional logics can frustrate the integration of security mechanisms among journalists because temporal demands and open communication with sources may be prioritized over more secure methods. Conflicts between journalists' goals and craft and IT's objectives can also result in reduced efficacy and collaboration between departments and contribute to that shadow IT culture I talked about. Third, the slow but eventual adoption of SecureDrop among news organizations is emblematic of a trend of institutional isomorphism, or when organizations within institutional fields mirror dominant practices and forms to avoid claims of negligence and to demonstrate public legitimacy. So once a number of news organizations adopt certain information security practices and other organizations mimic them to display progressiveness and to bolster legitimacy. So this suggests that newsrooms installing SecureDrop are performing legitimacy through security because they want to show their audiences and potential sources that they can be trusted with information. However, although news organizations show institutional isomorphism through the adoption of SecureDrop, they simultaneously reveal a decoupling, or when organizations separate their production activities from formal structures in response to internal institutional conflict or competing pressures. So news organizations show this by the lack of institutionalized security practices and policies throughout the newsroom. And this decoupling matters because it reveals externally facing actions to seek legitimacy, but it doesn't result in changes to practice internally that are needed to develop and maintain robust security cultures. So in turn, this can actually reduce legitimacy of a news organization if the gap between the said practices and actual practices is revealed to publics, which in turn can decrease trust in the news organization and also result in less transparency. That said, there's all these caveats. This decoupling is mitigated by the rise of a new institutional entrepreneur known as the security champion. However, the expertise of these champions is uneven, which in turn might lead to a false sense of security and potentially inaccurate information being shared around security. So the implications are manifold, right? This uneven and patchworked approach to development of security cultures in newsrooms is emblematic of the intransigence of journalism as an institution because it reveals how, despite the increasing intensifying threats that I talked about at the beginning, journalists are hesitant to respond to these challenges by engaging in new thinking and practices around information security. Yet, it's urgent to find a way to offset this intransigence because strong and independent journalistic institutions are necessary for democracy to flourish and we know that democracies are declining. As trust in democracies decrease, trust in specific democratic institutions like journalism also tend to go down. And reduced trust in journalism can contribute to a more hostile environment facing the press. As hostility increases, journalists may withdraw from different platforms, like social media platforms, for example, that provide space for the cultivation of new networks, peer sharing, and visibility for their work because they perceive the threats to themselves and to their families as too high. So these responses contribute to an environment of increased censorship and, as Weisford has noted, a form of limited digital publicity in which journalists dial back their social media presence and may choose to hide their identities. Additionally, sources may not come forward with important information because they're not confident in the journalist's ability to keep their identity obscured and therefore safe. And in turn, this can contribute to self-censorship among sources and journalists. So many consequences here, and these consequences reveal the need for further research. So I'm currently working on multiple research projects, but I wanted to talk briefly about two at a high level. I'm happy to talk about research design offline, but I wanted to sort of share a little bit about some of the projects I'm working on at a high level for the Sizer students in the room. So one project involves assessing how states are increasingly using surveillance technologies to control information, monitor speech, and harm journalists transnationally. So the link between surveillance and capitalism has increasingly been theorized by various academics in recent years, like Zuboff, but little academic research has examined how surveillance technologies, which are often developed in democratic nations and then sold ostensibly for law enforcement purposes, but to authoritarian countries, those governments then sometimes use these commercial spyware technologies to control information, monitor speech of journalists, harass them, and sometimes worse. So my project is interested in addressing this gap of academic literature by unearthing the political economy of surveillance technologies to inform the ways in which the intersection of corporate and government surveillance can harm journalists and free speech, and identify important policy, legal, and regulatory mechanisms to mitigate such consequences. And while I'm planning to use a variety of qualitative methods, I'm also interested in talking to students who have the technical expertise to potentially examine journalistic devices forensically to identify how these devices may have been compromised by commercial spyware. In a second project that I'm happy to share about today, I'm also interested in building on some recent research that I conducted with a colleague about strategic information operations against journalists. And so in our study, we looked at a couple different journalistic exemplars who are targeted by strategic information operations and the effects that these operations have had on journalists' news gathering activities, as well as their adherence and perception of journalistic roles. And in the next phase of the project, I'd like to dig deeper to better understand at a technical level how state and non-state actors are potentially impersonating journalists and carrying out spurious campaigns against them in a networked way, and how these SIOs affect trust between publics and journalists and their audiences. So the ability of journalists and news organizations to understand their adversaries and to take steps to mitigate these threats is essential so they can continue to do their work in an increasingly hostile online and offline environment, and to avoid, as the American journalist Bob Woodward was quoted in the beginning, saying to avoid democracies dying in darkness. So thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was really interesting. Oh, looks like Clem's got a question for us right off the bat.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay, James?
Yep. I can, yes. Oh. Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, that's great. First of all, thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Henriksen. It's as a professor in computer science, I always love to hear different perspectives that come not necessarily from the number crunching side of things. So this is a very, very, very interesting talk. My question for you is regarding your concept of decoupling. Wouldn't the decoupling of an organization by help an organization by forcing a lack of homogeneity that would trust just one system where maybe just one security information expert plays? I'm just curious as to what your opinion on that would be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for that question. So when I was using decoupling, I was talking more about it in terms of the use of secure drop, but then not instituting different security practices across the newsroom. So it was this this gap, right, between trying to show external facing legitimacy about what they're doing to various publics and audiences to try to generate trust or increase trust, and then internally they're not taking other steps to enhance the security in the newsroom. So I think decentralized networks can be strong, right, in some ways. Like, you don't want one size fits all, but you also don't want a situation where a newsroom is doing one thing and then gives the appearance of maybe having a robust security culture, but then it's not actually implementing things internally like they need to be doing. So what I've found is it's very ad hoc, which is, as I talked about, through the security champion, right? So depending on what the news organization has in terms of resources or which types of security champions might be operating within that newsroom, it really varies in terms of what is actually being discussed, what might be implemented, and things of that nature. So it's definitely important to have a nuanced approach to security based on the concerns of that specific news outlet or the journalists who are carrying out different stories. But if something externally is being suggested as being done, and hey, look, we're great at security, and then internally it's actually not happening, that's a problem for building a holistic security culture.
Yep, thank you.
Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself and just ask them. In the meantime, I think, Dr. Anderson, you mentioned the Pegasus spyware at some point earlier on. I think one recent example of that being used against journalists in recent history was against Khashoggi. Was it Jamal Khashoggi? He was the journalist who was assassinated in Turkey, and they found out after the fact that he had been being tracked using this Pegasus spyware. So, yeah, in terms
definitely
of
has real world implications, and it's actually his family members were targeted with it, and he was communicating with them extensively, right, thinking that the devices were secure. He took a lot of protections and precautions on his end, but his family members didn't do that as well. And so there was actually evidence of Pegasus on their phones later on.
That's sort of a perfect example of how cybersecurity is a group effort, not an individual effort. Do you know, are there any efforts underway or ongoing to sort of increase cybersecurity awareness amongst journalists through formal training or education programs?
Yeah, great question. I think the news reports about Pegasus have really opened the eyes of many journalists around the world in terms of like the capabilities of different spyware technologies and how they might be implicated, even if they're not in certain nations, right? Like how they might be affected. So there are some efforts being done in newsrooms related to increasing information security awareness. One problem, though, is well, there are many problems actually, but one issue at stake here is sometimes management doesn't feel like they have the resources to improve knowledge around information security, either through hiring specific information security positions or doing other mechanisms in the newsroom to increase security. So sometimes what happens is you might have a reporter who is either reporting on Pegasus and is very well aware of the implications that spyware technologies and other technologies might have on journalists, but they can't get it past a higher level, right? So like they only have the power to sort of raise awareness in the newsroom. They don't have the power to have the implementation of particular policies related to enhancing information security knowledge. So there are different like roadblocks within the news organization as it relates to increasing security awareness and implementation. But actually, there was this really interesting conference. It was the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. It happened in Sweden in late September. And the keynote there is Ron Diebert, who runs Citizen Lab out of the University of Toronto. And his lab does a ton of interesting work related to the analysis of spyware on journalists' phones. And his call to action among the investigative journalists was basically like, go figure out the political economy of these surveillance technologies and try to raise understanding and awareness of the implications that these technologies have on journalists. Like you can take your skills and try to raise awareness that way. But still within news organizations, there's a lot to still be done. And part of that is first raising awareness, but then sort of gathering resources and trying to level up the organization. One organization within the US that focuses specifically on information security for journalists and newsrooms is the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And so they offer a sliding scale, sometimes free training on security issues for different news organizations, but they're like one of the only ones in the country doing this type of work, and they're finding themselves increasingly in need among various journalists and news organizations.
Yeah, looks like Clem has another question.
Yeah, and I don't want to hog anything, but Jennifer, did you find any differences between different styles of journalism? I mean, some of them are more bloggers, some of them are going to be more broadcasting. Did you have an opportunity to look for differences?
When you say styles, do you mean as they relate to like their perceptions of information security, or?
No, as they communicate information, right?
Oh,
so yeah.
Yes, there are different tactics. I don't want to group them. I wouldn't say that I have the data to show specifically how different pieces or different populations undertook specific actions, but in general, I can talk about how there's been a leveling up among reporters in the use of Signal, for example, the encrypted messaging app. That increased significantly following the election of Donald Trump, when more of the population actually started using Signal. So sources were using it. They came to the journalist. The journalist was like, okay, let's use that too, then let's go forward. So that was helpful. And I think I would say that that's one of the most often used applications among journalists, sort of across the board. I've also found, but I don't want to make like broad claims here, but it seems like in terms of who I've talked with, right, print journalists tend to be slightly ahead of the game as it relates to these technologies, like how to use them with sources. Those on the investigative beat, national security, politics, they're sort of ahead of others in the newsroom more than lifestyle or sports. It seems like broadcast has a long way to go in terms of security technologies within the newsroom. Print seems to be slightly better at that, but then I've also been talking to institutions that are really well resourced, right? So I was talking to people at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and those are entities that actually do have funds to have specific information security trainers on staff, information security analysts. The ability differs, right, between those two organizations. The New York Times has more than the Washington Post, but there's an understanding that this is an important area to develop. So there is some more buy-in at certain places with more resources, and who may also experience more frequent attacks on their newsroom infrastructure and on their journalists.
All right, well, I'll ask one more question unless anyone else has one. But if I understand correctly, all of your survey participants were US based. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm wondering if you know, or if there's any way to know through anecdotal evidence or similar studies that have been done in other parts of the world, if journalists in other parts of the world have similar or very different sentiments towards information security.
Yeah, there are some studies that have been done in different areas. So there have been some NGO type reports from Mexico focused on how Mexican journalists are engaging with information security. There's also different reports in literature from sort of like the Balkan region in Western Europe as well. It does vary pretty significantly. What seems to be one of the indicators of whether or not a journalist cares about security is if they've experienced some sort of attack, like a digital, like a hacking attempt or phishing emails related to their work or online harassment campaigns. Then journalists are very interested in trying to respond and learn more about how to better protect themselves and their sources. If they haven't personally experienced these things, or they don't know of a colleague who's experienced something similar, then there's definitely more of a gap between the perception that knowing is important or doing something about it is important. So it kind of ties back to what I was talking about, this reactive orientation among journalists and managers, where something bad has to happen and then they say, oh, that was terrible, let's try to avoid that next time. And then they'll take steps, but it's not proactive typically in nature for a lot of these news organizations and journalists.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was great to hear from you about all this journalism, and it's another great example of one of the many applications of cybersecurity out there. It intersects with basically everything. So, yeah. So, yeah. With if doesn't look like there are any other questions, the survey link is in chat. So please, if you're a student, please fill that out. Otherwise, we'll say thank you and goodbye to Dr. Henriksen.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.